Imagine a single bar of chocolate, not a treat, not a reward, a weapon of war in its own quiet way. It is dark and dense and heavier in the hand than it looks. It does not melt in the heat of a jungle or crumble in the cold of a frozen forest. And here is the strangest thing about it. It was designed on purpose by careful men in white coats to taste almost bad. Not delicious, not tempting, just barely good enough to swallow, because this chocolate bar was not meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to keep a man alive on the worst day of his life, when everything else was gone. It rode in the pack of nearly every American soldier in the Second World War, from the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific. Soldiers hated it and joked about it, and more than a few times owed their lives to it. They gave it a grim nickname that has never been forgotten: Hitler's secret weapon. It was made in a small, tidy town in Pennsylvania by a company better known for making children smile, and it was produced in numbers so vast they are almost impossible to believe. Billions of bars, enough to feed an army for years. This is the story of the chocolate bar that helped win the Second World War, and of the strange, brilliant idea that made a piece of candy into a soldier's last line of survival. To understand why an army would ever want chocolate, you have to understand the impossible problem that every army in history has faced. A soldier in the field needs to eat, and not just anything. He needs energy, packed as tightly as possible, in something small enough to carry, tough enough to survive being dragged through mud and rain and fire, and stable enough that it will not rot in his pack over weeks or months. For most of history, that meant hard biscuit and salted meat, grim and heavy and low in energy. But chocolate, in theory, was almost a miracle answer. It is astonishingly rich in calories for its weight, a small bar carrying the energy of a full meal. It gives a quick, powerful lift to an exhausted body. And soldiers already loved it. In fact, chocolate had marched with warriors for a very long time. Centuries earlier, across the ocean, the warriors and messengers of the Aztec Empire had carried cacao as a source of strength, drinking it to steel themselves, valuing the bean so highly they used it as money. When chocolate reached Europe, armies noticed the same thing, that this strange, bitter food seemed to restore a tired body like almost nothing else. By the First World War, chocolate was already being tucked into soldiers' rations as a quick source of energy and comfort in the trenches. So the idea of feeding fighting men chocolate was not new. What was new, and what the Second World War would demand, was doing it on an industrial scale and solving the two problems that had always held it back. On paper, chocolate was the perfect emergency food, but it had two fatal flaws. The first was obvious to anyone who had ever left a candy bar in the sun. Chocolate melts. In the heat of battle, in a tropical climate, an ordinary bar would turn to a useless brown puddle in a soldier's pocket. And the second flaw was more subtle and more human. Chocolate is delicious. Give a hungry, frightened young man a delicious bar of chocolate and tell him to save it for a life-threatening emergency, and he will eat it that same afternoon, long before the emergency ever comes. So the army faced a riddle that sounds almost like a joke. It needed a chocolate bar that would not melt, and that a starving soldier would not want to eat. And to solve it, the army turned to the one man in America who had already turned chocolate into an empire. His name was Milton Hershey, and his own story is almost as unlikely as the bar he would come to make. Hershey was not born to wealth or genius. He was a man who failed again and again. His first candy businesses collapsed. He went broke more than once. But he was stubborn, and he had one great obsession: chocolate, which in those days was a luxury, expensive and rare, something only the rich could enjoy. Hershey became convinced that he could crack the secret of making smooth milk chocolate cheaply on a massive scale, so that an ordinary working family could afford it. And after years of trial and failure, he did exactly that. He built an enormous factory in the rolling farmland of Pennsylvania and began turning out millions of identical affordable milk chocolate bars. And in doing so, he took chocolate down from the shelves of the wealthy and put it into the hands of everyone. But Hershey did something else that tells you the kind of man he was. Around his factory, he built an entire town, a model town, for his workers, with comfortable homes, schools, parks, a trolley system, and tree-lined streets. A place designed to be a genuine community rather than a grim factory slum. He even founded a school for orphaned children and, having no heirs of his own, would eventually give away his enormous fortune to it. This was the man, and this was the town that the United States Army came knocking on in the years before the war. If anyone in America could make chocolate on the colossal scale a war would demand, it was Milton Hershey. The meeting that started it all took place in 1937, when an Army officer named Captain, later Colonel, Paul Logan came to Hershey with a very unusual request. He did not want a delicious chocolate bar. He wanted an emergency ration, a bar of last resort, that a soldier would carry and only eat when he was cut off, starving, and had nothing else. And he laid out 4 requirements that the bar had to meet, 4 rules that have become legendary. The first rule, it had to weigh about 4 ounces, small and light. The second rule, it had to be packed with energy, as many calories as could be crammed into that small size, enough to keep a man going. The third rule, it had to be able to survive high temperatures without melting, so it could go anywhere in the world, from the desert to the tropics. And then came the fourth rule, the one that has amazed people ever since, the rule that makes this whole story so strange. Colonel Logan said the bar should taste, and these are close to his actual words, just a little better than a boiled potato. Read that again. The United States Army walked into the greatest chocolate factory in the country and asked them to make a chocolate bar that tasted only slightly better than a plain boiled potato. And it was not a mistake or a joke. It was one of the most cleverly practical ideas of the entire war. The reasoning behind that fourth rule was pure psychology, and it was brilliant. Colonel Logan understood soldiers. He knew that if the emergency bar was delicious, it would never survive to be an emergency ration at all. A young soldier, cold and tired and hungry, with a wonderful bar of chocolate in his pack, would give in and eat it on an ordinary bad day. And then, when the true catastrophe came, when he was trapped behind enemy lines with no food for days, his life-saving ration would already be gone. So the bar had to be deliberately unappealing. Not disgusting, a starving man still had to be able to force it down, but dull enough, bitter enough, unexciting enough that a soldier would leave it alone until he genuinely had no other choice. The Army was not designing a candy bar. It was designing self-discipline, baked right into the food itself. And so the job of building this deliberately joyless chocolate fell to Hershey's chief chemist, a man named Sam Hinkle, and it turned out to be far harder than making a bar that tasted good. Think about the strange puzzle he faced. It is easy to make chocolate delicious, because that is what chocolate wants to be. It is far harder to make it hold its shape in blistering heat, cram a full meal's worth of energy into a tiny brick, keep it from spoiling for months in the field, and on top of all of that, deliberately hold back its flavor so that it would not tempt a hungry man, while still being just edible enough that a desperate one could get it down. Every one of those goals fought against the others. The very things that made chocolate melt in the mouth were the things that had to be stripped away. Hinkle and his team worked through recipe after recipe, adjusting the fats, the sugars, the flours, testing how each version stood up to heat, how much energy it carried, how it sat in the stomach, and how it tasted, or rather, how carefully it managed not to taste like much at all. It was a genuine feat of food engineering, one of the quiet technical triumphs of the war, and it produced something no ordinary factory would ever have chosen to make. The bar Hinkle created was unlike anything on a store shelf. It was made of chocolate, yes, but also sugar, oat flour, cocoa butter, skim milk powder, and added vitamins, all blended into something far denser and far less sweet than ordinary chocolate. Each bar carried around 600 calories, and a soldier's daily emergency ration was 3 of them close to 1,800 calories, enough to keep a man alive and moving for a day when he had nothing else at all. But packing that much energy into so small a bar made it incredibly dense, almost like a brick. In fact, the paste was so thick and heavy that it could not be poured into molds the way normal chocolate is. It had to be pressed into shape, packed into its molds by hand, because it simply would not flow. The finished bar was hard, dark, and only faintly sweet. To raise its melting point so it would not turn to mush in the heat, it was made stiffer and drier still, so hard that a soldier often could not simply bite into it. He had to shave slivers off it with a knife or crumble it or dissolve it in a cup of hot water to make a thick, bitter drink. This was Field Ration D, the D-bar, and it was now ready to go to war. It was, by design, one of the least pleasant chocolate bars ever made, and it was about to become one of the most important. Now, if you are enjoying this deep dive into how one small object shaped an enormous piece of history, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly what we do here: uncover the hidden stories behind the ordinary things all around us. And I would love to know down in the comments which country you are watching from, and whether anyone in your own family served in this war. Because when the D-bar reached the hands of ordinary soldiers, they had a great deal to say about it. They hated it, mostly, and they were not shy about saying so. The D-bar was bitter, chalky, and so hard it could break a tooth. Soldiers complained that it sat in the stomach like a stone, and that eating too much of it too fast could leave a man badly constipated and miserable for days. And out of that misery came the nickname that stuck to it forever. Soldiers, with the dark humor that keeps men sane in war, began calling the D-ration Hitler's secret weapon, joking that the bar did more damage to the American digestive system than the enemy ever did. Some men swore they would rather go hungry than choke one down. Others learned to grate it into hot water and drink it slowly. It became a running joke across the entire army, a shared misery that every soldier understood, the terrible chocolate that was somehow always at the bottom of the pack. And yet, and this is the heart of it, for all their complaining, the men kept carrying it. Because every one of them understood, underneath the jokes, exactly what that unpleasant little brick was for. It was not there to be enjoyed. It was there for the worst day of their lives. And for a great many of them, that worst day came. But before we follow the bar onto the battlefield, you have to grasp the sheer scale of what Hershey did, because it is staggering. When the war came, the little chocolate town in Pennsylvania transformed itself into a war machine. The factory ran around the clock, its production lines pouring out ration bars in numbers no one had ever attempted. By the height of the war, Hershey was producing something in the order of 24 million ration bars every single week, every week. Over the course of the whole war, the company turned out billions of bars for the armed forces, a river of chocolate flowing out of one Pennsylvania town and across every ocean on earth. The workers, many of them women who had stepped into the jobs left by men gone to fight, labored in shifts day and night, and the whole community threw itself into the effort. For their extraordinary output, the plant was honored again and again with the military's award for wartime production excellence. And there is something moving in the picture of it, a town built by one stubborn man to make ordinary people happy with cheap chocolate, now running its machines through every night of the war, its women and its older men on the lines in shifts, turning that same chocolate into a tool of survival for their sons and brothers and husbands fighting on the far side of the world. The people of that quiet Pennsylvania town could not pick up a rifle for every soldier, but they could make sure that in the pack of a frightened young man on a beach in France, there was a little piece of home and a fighting chance. Think about what that means. This was not a side project. Hershey became one of the great supply engines of the American war effort, and the humble, half-hated D-bar became one of the most mass-produced foods of the entire conflict. Behind every soldier chewing bitterly on his ration was a factory, a town, and thousands of hands working without rest to keep those bars flowing to the front. And on that front, the bar did its real work, quietly, in the moments no one filmed. It rode in the pack of the paratrooper who dropped into the darkness over Normandy and landed miles from his unit, alone, with no supply line for days. It rode with the Marines crawling across the burning coral of Pacific Islands, where the heat would have destroyed any ordinary chocolate, but the D-bar, and its even tougher cousin, built especially to survive tropical heat, held firm. It rode with the soldiers trapped and surrounded in the frozen forests of Europe during the great winter battles, cut off from supply. When a few hundred calories of dense chocolate could be the difference between a man who could still fight and a man who collapsed in the snow. It was tucked into the escape kits of pilots so that a flyer shot down over enemy territory would have something to live on while he tried to find his way home. It was packed into the survival gear of life rafts for sailors and airmen adrift on the open sea. And in the sweltering war of the Pacific, the bar met its greatest enemy, the one thing it had always struggled against: heat. Even the tough D-bar could soften and turn greasy in the brutal, humid furnace of a tropical island. So Hershey went back to work and created an improved version, a heat-resistant chocolate built to hold its shape even when the temperature climbed past 120 degrees. This tropical bar could sit in a pack under a blazing island sun and still come out solid, and it tasted a little better than the original Grim D-Ration, too. It became the chocolate of the Pacific War, going ashore with the troops on island after island, and it was so good at surviving heat that versions of that same heat-proof chocolate would later travel with soldiers for decades, and even one day be carried by astronauts into space. The problem of the melting chocolate bar, the flaw that had held chocolate back as a soldier's food for centuries, had finally been beaten. This was the bar's true purpose, the reason for every deliberate design choice, the reason it was made hard and bitter and nearly impossible to melt. It was built for the man who had run out of everything else, and in thousands of moments scattered across the whole war, on beaches and in forests and on rafts in the middle of the ocean, that grim little brick of chocolate did exactly what it was made to do. It kept someone alive long enough to make it to the next day. But the chocolate bar had one more power, and it was the opposite of war. As American soldiers pushed across North Africa, Italy, France, and finally into the heart of Europe, they carried chocolate not only for themselves, but as something to give away. And in the ruins of liberated towns and villages that had known nothing but occupation and hunger for years, the chocolate became something close to magic. Children who had never tasted such a thing or had not tasted it in years would crowd around the soldiers, and the famous cry went up in a dozen accents across the continent: any gum, chum, any chocolate. And the soldiers, far from home and aching for something good in the middle of so much horror, handed it out by the thousands of bars. To a hungry child in a bombed-out street, that piece of American chocolate was more than a sweet. It was proof that the nightmare was ending, that the strangers who had arrived were friends, that there was still kindness and abundance somewhere in the world. Chocolate became one of the quiet symbols of liberation itself, a taste of a richer, gentler world arriving on the heels of the tanks. In this way, the very same product that was engineered to be barely edible for a soldier became, in its ordinary, sweeter form, one of the most powerful tools of goodwill the American Army ever carried. It won hearts in exactly the places where the war had broken them. Steel and fire ended the fighting, but chocolate, handed from a soldier's hand to a child's, helped win the peace. So we come back to the question in the name. Did a chocolate bar really win the Second World War? Of course, no single thing won that war. It was won by millions of people, by staggering sacrifice, by industry and courage and blood on a scale the world had never seen. A chocolate bar did not defeat armies, but step back and look at what that bar truly was and what it truly did. It was a small miracle of design, a food engineered with such care and such understanding of human nature that it could keep a starving, cut-off soldier alive on the worst day of his life and be trusted to still be there in the bottom of the pack when that day finally came. It was produced by the billions, a torrent of energy and endurance flowing to every front on Earth. It steadied men in the cold and the heat and the fear. It saved lives on rafts and in frozen forests. And then, in its sweeter form, it reached out and befriended the very people the war had shattered. It did all of this while being, by deliberate design, one of the least enjoyable chocolate bars ever made, a bar the soldiers loved to hate and were quietly grateful to have. That is a kind of quiet greatness we almost never notice, the greatness of the humble, unglamorous thing that simply does its job, everywhere, without complaint, until the war is won. So the next time you unwrap a bar of chocolate and let it melt on your tongue, sweet and soft and made only to be enjoyed, take 1 second to remember its strange wartime cousin, the hard, bitter, brilliant little brick that a chemist built to taste like nothing much at all, that soldiers cursed and carried across the world, and that helped, in its own quiet way, to keep an army on its feet through the darkest years in human history. Now, I want to hear from you. Would you have been able to choke down a bar built to taste just better than a boiled potato? Or would you have gone hungry? And which country are you watching from? Tell me down in the comments, and if someone in your family lived through that war, share their story. I read every one. If you enjoyed this, pass it along to someone who loves history, and subscribe, because next time we uncover the surprising story behind another small thing that changed the world. It is all around you. You just have to know where to look.